morning, everybody. I have the honor and privilege to be sort of a moderator of this panel, not the least because I've been teaching at this institution for like 10 years now. Thank you very much, Holger, for your nice presentation and your task of organizing, putting all that thing together. I find that very amazing. You already sort of very briefly presented us, and particularly our hosts at this, our guests on this panel. So I will spare you with the details, not the least because we're having relatively short on time. Unfortunately, Christina will have to leave on time for a train to Venice, right? But not for vacation.
For a train to the airport. But
new technologies, right? So our topic is technologies and human rights. Now this is a very broad field, so we try to narrow it down to new digital technologies and human rights. And of course, now in the early days, when you were to sort of kick off a panel like this one, you would sort of look at what, sort of anecdotes that you would have found in the past, and later on with new technologies you would sort of Google something. What would you do now? That's what I did. You would sort of ask AI, of course, ChatGPT, as to what they have to say. And it's very interesting to very briefly summarize the answer ChatGPT came up with to the question of the relationship between digital technology and human rights. And very informative. It's complex and multifaceted, encompassing both opportunities and challenges. And then there follows a very short overview about the opportunities, freedom of expression. It supports active participation, democratic society, transparency, social and economic mobilization, access to information, etc. And then, of course, the more sort of pressing challenges that we're facing that are all over the place currently in the debate, but also I think in everyday life. Everybody really is affected by that. Surveillance and privacy violations, censorship and control, digital divide, disinformation, misinformation, manipulation, cybersecurity threats. And then, as a reasonable applier would also come up with a sort of balancing test, the balancing digital technology and human rights, and the call for regulatory approaches. That's where the lawyers come in. Corporate responsibility, a horizontal effect of human rights, not just an issue for the state, but also for the private individual, for private actors, particularly corporations, multinational corporations. And of course, empowerment through human rights, through education, through information, through transparency, as well as, and that's where not just the lawyers, but particularly the international lawyers come in, international cooperation. Now, as said, this is not very informative, but it's a sort of general stock taking. That's certainly a good starting point to provide you with also a sort of general overview of the general laying of this panel. Now, we thought that maybe we start off with trying to sort of find possible sort of scenarios where the interrelationship between new technologies, digital technologies, AI in particular, on the one hand, and human rights is tangible. What is there on a sort of factual side in the sense of the relationship between new technologies and human rights? And maybe, Christina, you might start.
Yes, a pleasure. Many thanks, Stephan, first of all, for the kind introduction. And actually, ChatGPT came up with quite a number of answers I found also in my scholarly research over the years, and actually also in the
because you asked more intelligent questions than I did.
So there are quite similar results. No, in any case, when I think it's a very good starting point to start mapping the phenomena, because obviously new technologies, new and emerging technologies, they comprise a variety of phenomena. It starts with internet-based technology, social media, then artificial intelligence, but it could also involve genetic engineering, 3D printing, and geoengineering. Still, I think for the sake of our topic, human rights and technology, the most promising is actually, and also where we have the most basis for starting to map out a framework. On the one hand, internet-based technologies and social media, and then also artificial intelligence. And perhaps starting with the consideration of the respective phenomena, internet-based technologies, including social media, can map broadly actually 3 generations of internet. The old first generation, old-style internet until the mid-thousands, where you have the Google, the internet research, very traditional one you hinted to in the what you would have done traditionally in terms of mapping and Googling. Then the second generation, actually, where we have, starting in the mid-2000s, more interactive platforms like YouTube, Facebook, then also starting Twitter, where we have more social interaction, making human exchanges possible, but also posing new questions in terms of freedom of expression, in terms of echo rooms, in terms of also harassment via platforms, you name it. On the other hand, but that's I think for a next round of questions. And then the third generation is actually new forms of interaction by internet, social media, but then also you include AI tools. For instance, online meeting rooms where you really meet in the virtual world, like hinting, and the next generation would be the metaverse. But then also online translation services, where you have online possibilities to meet with people speaking other languages. And also, yeah, I think that's the overview, and that shows already how many possibilities for private relationships and connections, but then also for the business world, are offered by social media and the internet. Another form would be then also, and that of course links to huge and major transformations, which poses opportunities for human rights in terms of realization, very easy access, for instance, right to education, very cheap access to education, very low-key possibility of social interaction, also in terms of political participation, very low level, for instance, in election campaigns, very low level engagement with voters, and kind of cheap, so campaign finances probably don't matter that much anymore when there is a possibility of interaction with the voters. But on the other hand, that poses, of course, incredible risks also. I mentioned already internet, social, child pornography, social online harassment, but then also the echo rooms, one-sided information, misinformation during campaigns, questions of privacy rights, social media, but then also a whole bulk of problems linked to online surveillance measures, GPS tracking, facial recognition, online privacy rights, actually, due to huge amounts of data gathering. So I think there is a huge bulk of questions relating to human rights we kind of need to get a hold on, and I think that we're going to discuss in a next layer. And then turning to artificial intelligence tools, of course, it involves huge number of new phenomena in terms of fields of application. For instance, what would be AI uses, on the one hand, it changes work relationships, structural relationships in the, for instance, traditionally by new forms of innovation, lower skill and kind of lower bottom professionals changed. Now it is the whole range of professionals. It's doctors, online consulting in terms of medical research, also in terms of questions of translation interpreters, by online forms of, so it really, there is huge structural implications, systemic implications in terms of what it means for different professions. Then obviously the question is in terms of new question of discrimination by biased algorithms, when you have new forms of online actually data tracing and privacy rights. And then finally, obviously, other forms of application which are opening completely new fields are all forms of on the one hand, in the more mobility private field, it would be automatically driving cars, but then in the forms of, for instance, IHL, it's also new means of warfare, autonomous weapon systems, etc. So there is a huge bulk coming with new forms of artificial intelligence, new forms and new possibilities to refer to these two new techniques. And of course, this not only poses question of privacy rights, but then questions in terms of even amounting to the right to life, and in addition also forms of discrimination between privacy rights and the right to life. But perhaps I leave it here, and yeah.
Yeah, I think that was quite something already in terms of stock taking and identifying the various scenarios. Usually I'm tempted as a moderator, I'm tempted to say, Niccolò, do you have anything to add here? I spare you with that question, but just to say, Niccolò, he has a lot of strong suits, and one of his current strong interests is focusing really on empirical studies in international law as well, something I think is totally understudied. You earlier said that currently you're working on the sort of material aspects of that interrelationship, in the sense of from raw materials up to ultimately, I don't know whether this relates to the supply chain, to corporate responsibility or accountability in a sense.
Well, thank you very much, Stephan, and thank you very much, Christina, for introducing this and going to such a detailed overview of the problem. Well, I mean, I think this is, by the way, I'm hoping that the microphone is working. I have no idea and no way to ascertain that, but if it does work, that's great. And this actually is a good starting point to reflect a little bit about the notion of technology, right? Because we are talking about technology in general, but everything really can be a technology. I mean, Bruno Latour wrote very famously, and although under a false name, the famous essay, The Sociology of a Door Closer, just to make this very point. Anything that we use on a daily basis can have a social dimension as a technology. And of course, now we have that in a variety of ways with many of the things that we use every day, and perhaps the next big thing really is going to be artificial intelligence. Now, the news, I think, came out yesterday that NVIDIA, the chip maker, got to a point where its shares are far more valuable than Tesla and a few other companies combined, which of course tells you something, which is essentially, well, during a gold rush, be the one who sells the shovels. And I think it is an important point to consider. So all of these things that we use, they do not come for free. They are sold, they are the product, and they have a market, and a market that needs to be satisfied and filled. So I think this is the first point. The second point is that, of course, I mean, because they are a technology, they have a life cycle. And I think because, again, as my accent reveals, I'm Italian, therefore I am very much continental, even though I have been transplanted to the UK, and so I was, by definition, born and raised as a positivist. I think it is important to reflect on how these things are regulated. Now, about 1 week back, the Framework Convention on AI has been adopted. And one of the things, and I hope I find the page again because I have opened it by mistake here and I can't find it again. Okay, there we go. One of the interesting things that I found was that in the context of the discussion of human rights, which is an important component of this framework convention, there is one snippet of text which I found particularly sobering. So it says, each party shall adopt or maintain measures to ensure that activities within the life cycle of artificial intelligence systems are consistent with obligations to protect human rights as enshrined in applicable international law and its domestic law. Obviously, it's a wonderful way to say nothing, but it's also very interesting because it does provide us with an opportunity to reflect on what really the life cycle of a technology is. And one of the things that I like to always quote is a snippet from one of the fundamental works, I would say, on the AI in general, which is a book by Kate Crawford, where she essentially says that artificial intelligence is not really something that is either intelligent or artificial. It is something that is both embodied and material, made from natural resources, fuel, human labor, infrastructures, logistics, histories, and classifications. So there is a lot of human stuff in AI, and who does it? How do they do that? And, well, again, because personal ethnography is now the next big thing, I will say another thing. Of course, I am Italian. I'm also what qualifies, I'm told reliably, as a millennial. So I will tell you a story about the other day when I was idly scrolling Instagram, and I was saluted with one very strange targeted ad which said, earn $15 per hour training AI chatbots from home. No AI experience needed, work wherever and whenever, 100% remote. And then there was a testimonial of one person saying, Outlier, this is the name of this company, makes me forget about driving for Uber. Okay, now you're asking a serious question to an AI chatbot. Would you ask your Uber driver for that? That is an important point that you really have to reflect on. So when we are thinking about this product, we have to think about the idea that the way this product is created is obviously something that has to be acknowledged as a capitalist exercise where, yes, of course, there is going to be innovation, there is going to be research, but there is also going to be a race to the bottom. There is also going to be a question of what the people who are involved in the creation of the technology itself are going to be doing and how they are going to be treated, what labor standards we're going to apply, what questions of delocalization, creative use of jurisdictional rules will be employed and so on. So again, it's a question of really reflecting on the technology that we have and reflecting of what we want to regulate precisely. Because of course we can say things about, well, there are questions about what an AI can do for the protection of human rights or what challenges a technology creates for the protection of human rights. But the question is that the technology itself, the making of it and the deployment of it is a question that is already to a point regulated by these bodies of law and should be regulated even further.
Well, thank you very much, Niccolò. You said that technology could be everything. The other day I heard that actually AI being based on algorithms, and there was an expert who said, well, like you said, technology can be everything, or is actually virtually everything. Algorithms and AI can be everything. Even a cooking manual could be, on that basis, artificial intelligence. It's really actually everywhere. Now, we've been focusing on the sort of factual aspects. Maybe we now move on as lawyers to the regulatory framework. The question, and Niccolò, you just mentioned the adoption of the draft AI framework convention, even though it might not be very substantive in terms of what it has to say. What is the regulatory framework currently in international that could, bits and pieces that, putting it together? It's a very sort of dissected question, a very fragmented issue, not the least because the actors involved are diverse. It's ranging from individuals to corporations, states, entire societies, etc. How is it currently tackled? And maybe the prospect, is it achievable, that we have a sort of more comprehensive approach to that. Christina, what would you say in terms of,
Yes.
as an expert on human rights law, I have to say that.
Many thanks, and perhaps I would like to start with some of the challenges linked to establishing a regulatory framework, which is on the one hand, of course, the immense speed of development of new technologies. So to a certain extent, the legal development always lags behind. And the question is how to establish a regulatory framework for something which is developing in immense speed, and not only that, you mentioned it, which is immensely diverse, so which comprises a variety of phenomena which are also constantly changing. So that per se poses challenges to regulation. Another challenge is also the diversity of communities involved. So we are speaking as lawyers trying to establish a regulatory framework, but then you need to really, you need an in-depth understanding of how technology works in order to be able to establish an appropriate framework. And the different communities do not necessarily coordinate and cooperate very clearly because they are quite different. Just to perhaps give you one personal experience, because I'm engaged also in election observation, and inter alia in observation with voting, e-voting and voting new technologies. Estonia is a front runner. And it was really tricky to establish a methodology to observe e-voting, and like it needed the cooperation of the tech guys. I didn't really understand what they were talking about, and I, as lawyer, needed to assess a legal framework whether it was appropriate or not, and I could just trust. They say that's certified and they are tested and that's fine, but once you move to this virtual room and trying to, on the one hand, establish a regulatory framework, and there we are then very much turned not only substantively but also to procedural issues, transparency, participation, also accountability, remedies, etc. But then also to get a hold on that phenomenon, making sense of what they are saying, and then observing that and saying it's okay or it's not okay. So the different communities involved pose a challenge to regulation per se. And then obviously, you refer to the piecemeal, the diversity and of very fragmented. And then, of course, also, to a certain extent related, is this black box phenomenon. There might be a room where you don't understand what technology is doing. And for instance, the use of algorithms, you get an objective result, but the question is, how did the computer reach that result? And it might be based on biased data. It might perpetuate discrimination because it refers to historical examples, but you might not be fully able to objectively establish that. And so discussing the regulatory framework is also linked to very much trying to get a hold on that. And basically, what we can see, we're now discussing business and human rights in the broader framework of that conference, can focus on two range of actors. On the one hand, the state as traditional duty bearer in the field of human rights, which is on the one hand, obviously, individuals hold rights in the traditional human rights framework against the state. And so it's up to the state, on the one hand, not to interfere with the respective rights in terms of interference with privacy, right to private life, not to engage itself in, for instance, as regards surveillance, facial recognition, etc. All that raises questions of state in the interest of national security, direct interference with privacy rights. If the use of lethal weapon systems by the state engages question of, in the field of IHL, more international humanitarian law, questions of direct interference, responsibility of the state for interference, possibly with the right to life. But then, obviously, it's also about the obligation to protect, so establishing a regulatory framework that individuals do not violate the rights of other individuals. And then it's a question of, are there, for instance, there were cases before the European Court of Human Rights in terms of surveillance at the workplace, and a company had engaged in video surveillance and online surveillance of its employees, and on that basis had dismissed a person who was not sufficiently regular space at the workspace. And so the question then was, which turned to, it was a case against Romania, and the European Court of Human Rights in the end established a violation of the European Convention because there were no sufficient remedies, and the consideration of the Romanian courts was insufficient and had not put sufficient attention to the sphere of the employee. So it's all establishing also, it's not only about responsibility for direct interference itself, but also about establishing a regulatory framework, which on the one hand, obviously, because there were also instances, for instance, about freedom of expression by online platforms, the question of what are their obligations in terms of being a very clear case against Turkey was when Turkey shut down the Google services. It was a violation of the freedom of expression, on the one hand of receiving information, Yildirim against Turkey, but obviously also the freedom of expression of the respective online services. But another example, in a case against Hungary, for instance, a platform had established a hyperlink to a YouTube video with defamatory content. And the question was, could the platform be held accountable for defamatory content on the YouTube video? And the European Court of Human Rights stated, no, that would be objective liability that goes too far, that interferes too much with the freedom of expression of the online platform, and that's why it's a violation by Hungary of the freedom of expression. So we need to very carefully balance, and the state has to do everything when to balance, on the one hand, the privacy rights, non-discrimination, etc., because on the other hand, there were well, perhaps I don't venture too far. In the interest of time, I can give some other examples afterwards, but just to make the point that on the one hand, the state needs to establish privacy rights in establishing the regulatory framework when we're speaking about the internet, social media, and freedom of expression of the respective platforms, and which obligations they can bear and be burdened with or not. And that's, and then obviously also establish an effective remedy in case of violations. And so, very bluntly put. And so, it is also about this horizontal layer to protect. And then, obviously, there are the question of obligations, or rather accountability of the respective business actors. But perhaps I leave it here and to give you some room to add also something in order not to monopolize too much.
No. Can I just respond briefly?
Sure, go ahead. Sure.
This was actually great because it gave me lots of things to think about in terms of, well, 2 or 3 different things, right? One is the body of law that is relevant to a particular instance of application of a technology. Again, I realized that I'm kind of monothematic insofar as I have reflected perhaps far too long on one technology in particular, but I think this can be extended further. And the second point is that what this regulation actually accomplishes in terms of, okay, we have been talking about, for example, remedies. We have been talking about the potential for horizontal human rights obligations and so on. It's a complicated area, again, for a couple of different reasons. The first is that different phases in the development and deployment of a technology attract different rules. Case in point, this is running on lithium, so trade law. Other points, what do we do, for example, when we look at the regulation and the type of rule-making that has been proposed in both the AI Act and in the AI Framework Convention. It's quite fascinating because essentially everything seems to be framed as obligations of result. But the reality of it is, well, we don't have the competence to do that for two different reasons. First, because, well, states are not great in terms of digital literacy, and secondly, because states don't pay the good developers enough. So they go to work for Google and OpenAI and so on. So it's a real problem because we don't really have the capacity to ensure that certain things are done in certain ways. The problem of the black box of the black box that Christina has mentioned is, I think, extremely interesting because it goes hand in hand with the problem of speed of deployment, speed of development, and realistically, and to be very frank, to the degree of whether or not we care too much about it or not. And I will make a couple of different examples. Now I will have to ask one expert in the room later on about this, but there has been a lot of discussion about whether or not patents should be granted for inventions, for example, pharmaceutical inventions, realized through AI. So if there is some sort of machine learning, is this an incentive to produce good research and potentially life-saving pharmaceuticals, or is this anathema and we should steer away from that as much as possible? This is a serious question, and I have not really been able to find a satisfactory answer one way or another. But the question here is, what do we regulate if we regulate it? I mean, like, do we want to go all the way to ensure that essentially everything that the AI does is explainable, which we're not going to get to in anytime soon anyways? Or do we want to be a little less risk adverse and accept the idea that we might get a good result from a technology we don't yet fully understand? So where do we stand on that? Do we prefer to regulate the way we would as environmental lawyers and always consider that the precautionary principle is the one thing we should always accept, or do we want to go further? And then, of course, I mean, Christina, I think you're absolutely right in also raising, and you did that a little earlier, the question of what this means for other bodies of law, which might look a little bit more exotic. International humanitarian law is a favorite of mine, but I guess not precisely for the question of, you know, like, I grew up with Terminator, so like I'm very fond of the idea of killer robots and so on, well, to a point. Obviously, please don't quote me on that.
Recorded.
Yeah. But I think it is interesting because now there are so many more applications of this technology, which are obviously, I mean, we are seeing that now in terms of targeting and decision making in the context of choosing what targets to actually engage. But there has been at least one other example. There is this company, which is the name of which I think is Clearview AI, which made a deal essentially and offered its services to the Ukrainian government for the purposes of identifying, well, essentially the dead. They said, well, we have a database, we have a data set, which we essentially scraped from VKontakte, the Russian social network, and we have all of these faces. Maybe we can be useful to do like Article 16 Geneva Convention identification of the dead. Is that acceptable? Is that something that we should stick to, or is this something undesirable, unethical, and so on? So I think there are several questions really which are raised by these and which can be complicated in the way we choose to answer.
Mm. Now, as Christina was raising the issue of third-party or horizontal effect of human rights, I mean, this has been maybe not from the very beginning, but still from early stage of human rights protection in law at the forefront. But I think with artificial intelligence and new digital technologies and the problems that has created, it has assumed a completely new dimension. I mean, human rights are essentially still a jurisdictional issue within states, actually, but with the whole issue of, from the very beginning, from digging, exploiting raw materials to the end consumer, we have, I don't know, at least a handful of states being involved. Now that makes things even more complex. Do we need, and is it achievable, do we need new approaches to lawmaking on the international level? Can we sort of copy-paste traditional human rights protection regimes? Do we need something new? Is that imaginable, if you will?
Actually, well, coming from the human rights field, I would answer in particular with actually keeping in mind the challenges of having a dynamic field, a variety of actors involved, and actually a very patchy so far framework of obligations in terms of regulatory framework. So what I would, and Stephan Sonnenberg et al. Have done human rights-based approaches to new and emerging technologies. And I think really a human rights-based approach, which on the one hand is based on the substantive obligations, but then takes all the process-oriented side, and I'm going to mention the different dimensions and principles, are what we need to consider to kind of get a human rights perspective and a hand on the development of new technologies. So what would that involve? That would involve already starting with a human rights framework, application of human rights, being privacy rights, but also or the other substantive human rights obligations, then obviously having a clear non-discrimination perspective, taking particular care of marginalized or vulnerable groups which might be hit by the development of new phenomena, and that biased algorithms are one thing, but then also the involvement, for instance, of older sectors of the population, or not, or sectors of the population, for instance, discussing political participation, who cannot access technologies the same manner as a rural-urban divide. So minorities in the field who might not be have access to IT. So in trying to a human rights-based approach would be non-discrimination, then it would imply a firm level of transparency, that being like obligation to be as transparent in terms of also explain what is happening, also in terms of, but also in order to, and that would be another dimension, the accountability dimension. So identifying who is responsible and who is, or trying to identify who is at stake, and establishing according remedies at state level, but then also of possible, and there might draw on the Ruggie principles actually, guiding principle on business and human rights of 2011, where we have actually these grievance mechanisms where you need to, in order to be effective, they need to fulfill, be legitimate, be accessible, etc., fulfill a variety of criteria. So also possibilities mean to redress would be one. Then participation would be another, to involve in the regulatory process those who at stake, who are concerned, but who also have a say, and stakeholders which are concerned by the respective measures and by the application of new technologies. So I think really a human rights-based approach to regulatory attempts and to get a hold of new phenomena is a very promising, or from a human rights perspective, I think the most promising tool, because we have on the one hand substantive elements, but then also participation, procedural elements, and this question of remedies, which all come along, and which to kind of, I would say, help us to accompany the whole process to the best possible. With the procedural criteria also be enabling, and the question of participation, a more flexible procedural approach to regulation actually.
This is, I agree with you. I think essentially we have to start from the international, supranational dimension. But I think there are, I think Stephan, you are correct when you say that in many ways this remains, and in a way the entire legal framework of the world remains a jurisdictional problem, depending on how you look at it. And I think the regulation of new technologies is really no stranger to that. I mean, I remember when the UK decided to publish its white paper on its position on AI. And that was very interesting because it came a few weeks after the start of the debate about the EU AI Act and so on. And essentially 1 week later, sure enough, OpenAI decided to open up a headquarters in London. And of course, I mean, this is not random. This is something that we have to acknowledge. We know why they're doing it and so on. But the second thing that I think is particularly fascinating is kind of this interaction between the idea of the creation of a system which is going to be international, supranational, and perhaps informed by certain experiences that we had in regulating a particular technology, and the role of these private stakeholders. So another example that comes to mind was, and again, I'm singling out this particular company, but I remember the discussion during the Senate hearing of Sam Altman, the key person behind OpenAI. And one of the things I found extraordinary was that he was really pushing for an International Atomic Energy Agency style framework treaty on artificial intelligence. And the only thing I could think of was, is it bad that they want it? Because honestly, they have everything to lose from it, okay? So if they want it, they must have done their due diligence, okay? And that reminded me of another historical precedent, which is the 2017 Brussels Declaration, which was something that happened during the 2017 World Science Forum. And in practice, it was a number of things about like a 20-point declaration on the advancement of science and so on. It was very well received until the point where it was revealed that there were a number of lobbyists essentially doing like all of the handiwork, like tobacco companies and so on. So I think we have to be very careful about the type of regulation that we accept to do, and also the type of stakeholders that we involve, because obviously we have to involve them, because otherwise they're not going to play ball. And they are in a position not to play ball. That's the thing, because they can always relocate somewhere else and be very happy with that. But the issue is we have to deal with them, and we have to do so in a way that is not necessarily just paying lip service to some values and actually does retain some teeth in order to govern their activities.
If we look at human rights and their affectedness by artificial intelligence and digital technology, this is not just something we're talking about intrastate issues in terms of human rights protection, but it assumes, and Christina, this is one of your strong suits, as it were, an international relations aspect between states. I mean, human rights essentially depend on a free, liberal democracy, rule of law, participatory processes, freedom of expression, etc. And all of that is under threat through interference, particularly in election processes. And much, if not all of that, is also steered by artificial intelligence. What to do against that, if any means available, and is there any sort of perspective in terms of, again, tackling that through regulatory processes on an international level?
Yeah, many thanks, Stephan, because you hint, and actually it's a very topical issue, because the elections to the European Parliament, there was so much question of how to deal with possible instances of foreign interference in elections. We had it in the past US elections also. So, but also in a variety of processes, and obviously, and that shows actually on the one hand, not on the one hand, on the other hand, because obviously there is a lot of potential in using IT the internet, social media in election processes, it offers incredible amounts of possibilities of interaction with voters on a very low key, on engagement with voters, etc. But obviously, it also opens up possibilities of interference by domestic actors, but then also by foreign actors. And that can take two levels. On the one hand, of course, by misinformation, false information, especially during the election campaign. And actually, the closer we come to election day, the more problematic it gets, because there might not be possibilities to counter fails and misinformation, and it goes that far that actually, Facebook fails Facebook and online identities, but then also logos by like the Spiegel and really the media, they're fake, they just use and to identify its reputed and journals with kind of which are known to the readers, and they are just the logos are used to provide false information. So for the recipient, it might be very difficult. For the voter, it might be very difficult to identify what is real information and what is misinformation, and that obviously creates a whole body of problems. So that misinformation, falsified information, is one problem of interference with elections, but then also the more IT technologies are used in electoral processes, starting from voter registration, election administration, but then also internet voting, online voting, counting of votes, that of course opens room for hacking, for cyber, for network coordinated network attacks, and actually there are two, or the main means to counter, as I would see it, is really also by, on the one hand, establishing, trying to protect the internet as such by means of technology, or the platforms as such, trying to identify false content or problematic content, also using AI. And also using the new technologies and being a bit quicker in terms of than those who try to interfere. But then the other or the other means would be trying to establish safe, to still keep one foot in reality, in the sense of, for instance, not only relying on e-voting, but then also still having a second real-life attempt where the voter can still go to the, and actually that was in Estonia, when you had the full-fledged possibility of e-voting, but then you had the possibility still for each voter to also vote in the polling station. So to have like a safety net in real life, so to say, or during election campaigns to still have like real encounters with voters, and not to only rely on social media campaigns. In that sense, it would be, but obviously, given and the problem algorithms which might generate false content, there is obviously it's a huge risk and a huge danger for interference with election campaigns, and a number of but being aware of it and trying, what I said, on the one hand trying to counter it by technological means, but then also trying to have it based in reality and informing, like being trying to be as transparent as possible about it might be another possibility to approach it.
That creates certainly an accountability gap, because if the election interference is owed to a foreign state, there's hardly any sort of remedy that you could sort of resort to on the international plane, right?
Well, you obviously the question would be then that discussing international law, is it, a principle of non-interference, question of also extraterritorial sovereignty, obviously, and extraterritorial application of the respective states' human rights obligations. In that would be the three pillars to say. But otherwise, no, that's why I said we really need to also try to counter by technology, technological means and to be a bit quicker, because it would also, an election campaign is an election campaign, and then the election takes place, and then it's the vote is done. No, it's also kind of running against the time. The closer it gets to election day, the more problematic the issue is, and obviously trying to identify and then counter fails information, and to have an as open forum of discussion as possible would be a means, I think.
Closing in, Niccolò, any sort of famous last words in terms of a sort of outlook? You were talking about life circles.
In very, very quickly, I think this is extremely fascinating, and the point of well, two things really. On the one hand, the question of disinformation, the question of interference, and so on. I think we are in a very bad place, and I will say why. Well, first, because even the question of non-interference, I mean, like reading closely and reading between the lines in the latest ICJ case between Ukraine and Russia, well, essentially the court said in so many words, you can say whatever you want about another country, and that is not illegitimate and unlawful, which is already a problem. The second issue is, well, for what really makes technological disinformation distinctive is the scale on which you can do it. Yeah. And we are still worrying about the wrong thing, in my view, which is, for example, on AI and language models, we're trying to make ChatGPT make sure that it's not going to tell us a wrong story about the birth of Barack Obama. But the problem is that nobody who wants to do this seriously on a large scale will use any of these tools. They will use something else, which is now, because of the nature of the development of open source technologies and because of how many people you needed to train these things, are readily available in the public. If you've ever received Nigerian prince scam emails, be sure there is now a model for that. So it's the problem is that ship has sailed. You know. So the question is, what do we do? In practice, the only alternative we have is now essentially fighting fire with fire. So we need technologies to fight other technologies. And this, again, gives an enormous amount of leeway to those who, again, have been selling the shovels and finding gold. So that's the problem I see now. So whichever problem we are seeing at the moment, it is not something that can be resolved only by the state. It requires the cooperation of private actors, which may or may not be interested. So,
fighting fire with fire, fighting artificial intelligence with artificial intelligence. Sorry, but still, as you said, in the context of election interference, providing for us a safety net in the sense of not just in applying e-voting, but also analog voting. On that basis, we may conclude fighting fire with fire, but still invoking our natural intelligence in that respect too. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.